Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Christopher Harrison, and today we're going to be drinking a little coffee and playing around with a bit of Django. So I'm super excited to be here this morning. Hopefully my audio video is all coming through okay. If you want to say hi, ask questions, and all that good stuff, please do so. The chat window is open. This is all, of course, live. And, a big part of what I'm hoping to do today is make this a little interactive. So I have a plan in place of what it is that I want to build, the demos that I'm going to walk through, and so forth. And so I am going to sort of kind of keep down that path. But along the way, if you have questions or anything else, please, by all means, feel free to ask. So I'm going to do my absolute best to answer all the questions and all of that good stuff. I'm also going to mention here real quick that, I get lonely. So, please do say hi. Otherwise, it's just me talking to a computer screen. I do that enough. So, all the interaction is fantastic. So with that, let's go ahead and get rolling here and start to talk a little bit about Django. The software books that I have behind me. What do I have behind me? I've got design patterns, refactoring, so a couple of old classics. I've got the Satya Nadella book, and a couple of other just like general design books. And then down below, I've got a couple of running books, and then I've got a book by Dick Schaap, may he rest in peace, was one of my favorite sports writers for anybody who happens to know him. So, but yeah. So, and I see out there, Algish, good morning. Okay, cool. So what I want to do this morning, hey Akash, is I want to talk about Django. So Django is probably without a doubt my favorite web dev platform. And the reason that it's my favorite web dev platform is because it really helps ease the most common web dev scenarios that you're going to run into. That most of the time, when you're creating a line of business web application, what you're going to be doing is really focusing in on creating what's known as a CRUD application. So create, retrieve, update, and delete. Or in other words, the application is really going to be a front end for a back end database. And so Django has a bunch of built-in utilities to help ease all of that, and also to give you a lot of the built-in features that you're going to be looking for in almost any type of web application without having to do a lot of work to get that. And this is going to include, as we're going to see, a cool little admin page that will give us the ability to manipulate data. And this is going to be the real focus of today, a fantastic built-in authentication system that we can take advantage of. And what we're going to see, and where I'm going to be building through all of this, is the fact that we can enable login, log out, account registration, and all of that with just a handful of lines of code, and also at the same time still be making sure that our site looks pretty good. So let's start off by taking a look at the app that I've got and the scenario that I'm trying to build out here. Now, I'm going to mention the fact that I am using there we go. Okay, I am going to mention the fact that I am using WSL, so Windows Subsystem for Linux. I'm a huge fan of WSL. The reason that I use WSL is because at the end of the day, Python is really built for Linux. And while there's certainly a lot of libraries and so forth and documentation that do a very good job of highlighting the Windows side of things as well, I still find that I get the best support if I'm just programming in Linux. And so I love WSL for that because it gives you some great integration back and forth between Linux and Windows. I'm going to mention that nothing that I'm going to be doing, though, is going to be focused in on Linux. So if you're a Windows developer, you do everything on Windows, that's fine. Literally nothing that we're going to be covering today is going to be OS dependent. So don't worry at all about that. The main reason that I call that out is partly because I just love WSL. And then also, because you might notice down here at the very bottom that it's mentioning WSL Ubuntu. So I am using WSL there. So the question is, can you install WSL on an 8 gig Windows Pro, or do I recommend 16 gigs? Honestly, I would just always recommend 16 gigs, just like on spec. But what's great about WSL is it's not a VM. And so I don't need to, like if I was setting up like a Docker container or a virtual machine, I don't need to dedicate a spot of RAM to it. So it really does run seamlessly. So you should be able to run it just fine on 8 gigs of RAM. That really shouldn't cause an impact there. But just on spec, I mean, if you can get 16 gigs of RAM, always go with 16 gigs of RAM, you know? Always go for the extra donut, always. All right, so let me go ahead and take a look at the application that I've got here. So what I've got is, there we go, is I've got my model set up. So the way that Django works is your data, of course, is going to be represented by models. And Django has a built-in ORM, object relational mapper, that's going to automatically manage how we're going to communicate with the database based around these models. So these models now define what I want my data structure to look like. The scenario that I'm building towards is I'm building a web application that could be a pet shelter. So somebody could come along, they could adopt a pet, and away you go. So, you know, like real good, hearty stuff. We're really trying to do something good here. The question is there a repo on which you can pull down my existing code? Unfortunately, there isn't. I apologize for that. I will post the code afterwards, but unfortunately, I don't have the starting point up anywhere yet. So I do apologize for that, Mark. But good morning. Okay. So, but that being said, I do want to highlight this here real quick, is I'm starting from a very stripped down base. So about the only real thing that I've done is I've installed Django, and I've created 3 models, which I'm going to be showing off here, and I've registered them on the admin page, which I'm also going to show off in just a couple of moments. So I really haven't gone very far into this, so there's not a lot of existing code. Yeah, it will be posted to there as Megan calls out. Megan, by the way, is also going to be hanging out in the chat, helping out, answering questions as well. So feel free to say hi to Megan, and she's also here. She's partly here to help make me look good, which certainly takes an awful lot of work. All right. So back over here to our model. So what you're going to notice is we've got 3 main classes that we've created that all inherit from this Django model. The first is an adopter. So this would be somebody that would be able to adopt a pet. We've got our pets, and we've got our application. Well, thank you, Megan. So the application is going to allow somebody to apply to adopt a pet. So we'd be looking for the adopter and for the pet. And then there's going to be a Boolean option here about whether or not they've signed a waiver, just simply saying, yes, I'm ready to adopt a pet, everything that I said was true, all that good stuff. On our pet, we've got the name and we've got the description. And then on the adopter, we're going to grab the first name, the last name, and the background. So that way, you know, the adopter could go ahead and say like what experience it is that they have with pets, etc., whether or not they've got a yard, all that good stuff. Now, the one big thing that I want to highlight here is this little option right here for user. So I mentioned earlier the fact that Django has a lot of great built-in functionality that we can take advantage of. And so if I bring back up the Django website here, and I scroll really kind of all the way down here under Common Web Application Tools, you'll notice that there's actually a built-in authentication system that's made available to you. It's right there. There's nothing else that I need to do to activate this except for basically just setting up the UX, which is what we're going to do. So all of that is right there. It's got the database already set up. It will automatically manage salting and hashing our passwords and like really all the normal good security practices that we're going to be looking for. So all of that is baked right in. Now, again, my scenario, what I want somebody to be able to do is I want them to be able to register as a pet adopter. Now, if we break this down a little bit further, I'm of course going to want them to authenticate. I'm going to want them to provide a username and a password. And in any system that does this, that ASP.NET, for example, has a great identity system as well. And so ASP.NET can also allow you to do things, things like this. In any of those scenarios, you do have a decision to make. Because a user on your site is never just going to be a username and a password. There's always going to be more to it. There's going to be some form of a profile. And in my case, my profile is going to be under this little adopter. And so I have a decision to make. One thing that I could do is I could go ahead and create my own custom user and combine all of this information together. So their name, their background, their username, and their password all into one object. I could do that, but don't. And the reason that I really don't want to do it that way is because what happens if later on I decide that I want to migrate to a different authentication system? That maybe I decide that I don't like Django's built-in one, that I'm going to go use some custom one. Django's going to be fine with that. It works. But now the object that I would have created is going to be bound to that auth system. Or what happens if maybe I decide to enable Facebook authentication or Twitter authentication? Again, sort of that same thing, that now the information that I might be getting back, especially from like Twitter auth, where I might not have access to the person's name, is going to be a little bit of a challenge. So for those reasons right there, we really should just go ahead and create a relationship between our profile and the user. And so that's actually what I'm doing right here. This user right here is the built-in Django user. And so now that's going to become part of my adopter here. And this profile pattern that I'm showing here is generally speaking the recommended way to go, because on top of all of that, I typically don't want to have in one object the user's information and their password, because that can also become a little bit of a security challenge as well. Okay. Now the next thing that I've already got set up inside of my system here is I've registered both of those models with the admin page. So what does the admin page do for us inside of Django? Well, I'm glad you asked. So let me shoot over here to my website. So this is running here. And what you're going to notice is that I haven't created any views or anything like that. So this is just the default page that, that I'm getting here. So built into Django is this wonderful little admin page. And so I actually did not write any code to make this work. Little sip of some cold brew there. See, told you, code and coffee. I didn't write any code to make this admin page. This is built right in. The only thing that I had to do to turn this on after I did the installation of Django was simply those 2 lines of code that you see right there, where I went ahead and registered the 2 objects inside of the admin page. That was literally all the code. So there's nothing up my sleeves except for my arms. There's nothing that I did that was overly extensive. I installed Django and I added in 2 lines of code. Which, by the way, speaking of installing Django and working through all of this, I do want to highlight here on the docs that the walkthrough does a great job of showing off everything that you really need to know to get up and running with Django, and they highlight the admin page and doing the registration and everything else. So if you're not overly familiar with doing that installation, definitely go check that out. Okay, so let me go ahead and log in, and what you're going to notice is that there's the adopters and there's the pets. Right now, I've created pets. So there is Roscoe and there is Sammy, and I could open up each one of these and see them all. And if I come back over here and I add in one more, maybe a name of Artichoke, and this would be a golden doodle puppy, and go ahead and hit save, that's now going to be entered into the database. So it gives me this great utility that I can go ahead and allow my internal staff, allow my admins to use to modify my data. And that's wonderful. But of course, I don't want the general public to be using this. So for the general public, if I want somebody to come in and register as an adopter, I don't want to give them access to the admin page. I instead want to have them start using the UX that I'm going to build for them. And this, for starters, is going to be the primary focus of what we're going to be building today, which is going to be the UX. Now, the way that I'm going to work through this is I'm going to start off by creating the list and details pages for the pet. So that way we can see a little bit about how the view system works inside of Django. Then we're going to take a look at how we could set up a registration page or a create page for an adopter. Then we're going to turn our attention to allowing somebody to register with a username and a password, how we could do login and log out, and then tie everything together. And we're going to do all of this in about an hour and a half. And this, again, fantastic thing about Django is all possible because of the built-in capabilities that are available to us. Okay, so let's start by taking a look, first of all, at our views. So a view in Django is just like a view in software development. So it's going to be, hey, we're going to display out some level of information here. Now, when we think about creating a web application that's a front end for a database, which is exactly what I'm doing here, there's going to be a lot of commonality. That I'm going to want a page that's going to allow me to list off everything inside of a table or a response to a particular query. I'm going to want to be able to show an individual item. And so fortunately, built right into Django, there are a whole bunch of generic views that are already there that we can take advantage of, that are going to handle all of the normal calls that we would need to make back to a database for us. So let's start off by taking a look at the list page. So what I want to do here is I want to list all pets. So I'm going to create a class, and I'm going to call this my pet list view. And I'm going to say generic views dot, and then you're going to notice that built right in, there's a list view. Now what list view is going to do for us is it's going to give us the ability to say, hey, what data type are we talking about? Well, we are talking about a pet. And then it's also going to say, okay, well, where is the HTML file that you want me to use to display all of this out? So in my case, this is going to be under pets list.html. And then it's going to say, all right, well, inside of there, you're going to have a little bit of code that's going to loop through all of these pets to display them out. What do you want me to call that object? Well, I want you to call that object pets. All right. And then the last thing that it's going to want to know is it's going to want to know there we go, the query set. And so okay, there we go. So what I'm going to do for my query set, so this is right here, this is going to be the data that it's going to go grab from the database for me. Now in my case, I'm going to use from models, pet, objects, all. So let's break that down here real quick. Let me open up my models again, and let's take a look at pet. And let's highlight the fact that pet inherits from model. So because of the fact that it inherits from model, grafted onto it is going to be all the capabilities of an ORM for us, object relational mapping. So that we're going to have the ability to create items. We're going to have the ability to do queries. We're going to have the ability to interact with the database all through that object. Now, all the functions that we're going to be looking for are going to be off of this object's property right here. And in my case, I'm just going to grab all the items. Now, I'm doing this because right now I've got 3 pets that are listed there. So obviously, I'm not going to break anything by just going to grab all of the data. You would probably want to do some form of pagination or some form of a filter in most scenarios. And you can absolutely do that inside of here. If you go take a look at the docs, you're going to notice that there's great support for doing paging, for indicating this is the page size, this is the page number that I want, and all of that good stuff. But in my case, because I'm only dealing with 3 items, I'm not going to worry about that. But I do want to highlight the fact that Django can do that for you. All right. Cool. A little more cold brew. Coffee is important. Okay. So that's actually all the code that I need for my list view. So this will display all items. Let's now take a look at a detail view. Yes, the session is going to be available to view later. It'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Sorry, didn't have to necessarily jump in and answer that for Megan. Megan, will this session be available later? Okay, so for our detail view, let's think about this for just a second here. For a normal detail, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go load one item from a database. Now, 99 out of 100 times, the way that we're going to find that one item is going to be based on its primary key. I know that, you know that, and Django also knows that. So as a result, this detail view will automatically go look for an item based on the primary key that's passed in to this view. And we'll see how it's going to be passed in a minute, but basically I don't have to worry about it. All that I need to do is say model equals models.pet, my template name, oops, just like before, and my context object name, just like before. And that's it. That's all the code that I need to write to communicate with my database to go get all of the data that I need. That's it. That's all the code. And so now this frees me up. This allows me to instead focus in on my HTML. So let's turn our attention to the HTML then. Now, what I have done here is I have created a base page here that I'm going to use for my entire site. Now, on this base page, what I'm doing is I'm using I'm using Bootstrap here. Now, you can decide whether or not you like Bootstrap. Personally, I love Bootstrap because of the fact that it allows me to make pages that look decent without necessarily being overly gifted at CSS. I will openly admit I can do what I need to do in CSS. I'm pretty decent at it, but I am by no means great at it. So using a tool like Bootstrap makes it easier for me, and I can still get pages that look pretty good. So I personally like Bootstrap. Bootstrap for the win, if you ask me. So I'm using Bootstrap. So on my template here, I'm loading up the CSS. Down below is all of the JavaScript. It's just a normal Bootstrap template there. There's a question here, Kivki, is there a Bootstrap 5? There's going to be a Bootstrap 5. It's currently in development. One big thing that they are going to do with Bootstrap 5 is get rid of the dependency on jQuery, which is probably one of the biggest complaints about Bootstrap. Now, I'd also admit that I like jQuery. That's a conversation for a different time, but there is going to be a Bootstrap 5, and again, the big thing is they are going to eliminate the dependency on jQuery. Okay, now the core for Django that I want to highlight here is right here in the middle, which is this little block. So this is going to be my core template, and then I'm going to be able to effectively pour my content into here. Now, if you're familiar at all with Jinja from Flask or, really a lot of other HTML templating tools, this is pretty common that you've very likely run across this in the past. And if you haven't, well, what's great is that when you learn this, you're going to be able to reuse these skills in a lot of other locations as well. So by my using this base page, it's going to give me the ability to focus in on the core HTML that I want to write just for displaying out my details and my content and all of that. So let's go ahead and create two HTML pages here. detail HTML and list.html. Okay, so the way that we use that base is by saying extends base.html, and then okay. So I can in fact touch type, but the catch is on, like, you know, where the % sign is and things like that. I can't always hit those with touch typing, and my microphone is right here. So if you ever like see me sort of looking over, it's just because I'm looking over my microphone to see my keyboard, which is down here. So the question is, shouldn't it be petswhack base.html? And that's a great question. So the answer is no, that if we take a look at the folder structure, if I zoom in, this will hopefully help make it a little clearer. So my base HTML is off of templates. And so both of those files here, detail and HTML, are inside of pets. So base is inside of templates, so that's where it's going to be pulling it from. And that's quite frequently, if you're using one core template, which in my case I am, how you would set it up is that would be in the base there. Okay. Now, if we remember back over here to our views, on our list view, the object name is pets. So over here on my list, what I can now do is I can now use that. So this pets, where's that being declared? It's being declared back here inside of my list view. And so now I'll be able to display out, and I'm for right now just going to put in an empty hyperlink here, the name of the pet. Okay, so what this is going to do is this is going to loop through every single pet, and then it's going to display out the name. Now, one real quick thing that I want to highlight is the difference between the double curly and the curly with the %. So the double curly is effectively like a response right. It's just going to take whatever the string is and just display it out. Whereas the % here gives me the ability to run some bit of code. So you're going to notice, for example, that we had that with the extends. We're running code here. We're not looking to display something. You're going to notice that here with the block. We're running code here. We're indicating, hey, I want this to be placed into that block. We're not displaying anything. Same thing then with our for. But now when we want to go grab the name of our pet, we do want to display that out here. Okay. And I'm just going to add in a little Bootstrap stuff here. Okay, cool. So now what this is going to do is this is now going to display out the list of all of my pets. It's also eventually going to give me the ability to add in a hyperlink, which I'll demo here in a minute once we set up our route here. Okay, on the detail, I'm going to make my life a little easier here. I'm just going to do a quick copy and a paste. And now I'm going to go ahead and say div, and let's say class equals call3, and I'll say name. Let's put that into a strong. There we go. And div class equals call9, and pet.name. Okay, so the question again of where is pet coming from? Again, that was declared inside of our view. So it's automatically baked in for us. Okay, so let's set up our description and our description. So again, the great advantage is I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, let's call it 9 lines of code. That's all the code that I've got. And I've instead been able to focus in on my display. How do I want things to look? Django then takes care of the rest for me. Now, the last little catch that we have here is we do need to tell Django how we want users to get to this data. And this is a common thing across all web apps, across all web frameworks, is this thing called routing. That when we think about like a mobile app, user clicks on a button and some bit of code is going to run behind the scenes. And you do that by setting up an event handler. I don't have event handlers here. So the way that the user is going to indicate what it is that they want is by specifying some URL. So in my case, if the URL comes to the root page, what I want to do is I want to go grab that list view that we created, and that is what's going to display out. Now I'm going to give it a name just so I can access this a little bit later. We'll see why that's going to become important here in a second. All right, and let me say views dot detail view as view, and then name equals pet detail. Okay, now if you remember from a second ago, one of the things that we called out here is the fact that I want to be able to pull out an individual pet. And we're going to do this by the primary key. And what I said was that the primary key is automatically going to be passed back to this. So the question becomes, well, how is that going to happen? I'm glad you asked. The way that that's going to happen is on my path right here, I'm going to indicate I want an integer. And I'm going to call the integer that's passed in PK. And PK, of course, is not short for penalty kick. It's a different scenario. Instead, that's going to be short for primary key. So all that I need to do is just make sure that I've got a parameter right here that's called PK that will automatically be passed into my detail view, and no additional code is going to be required. And I can also take advantage of this. I can also go look that up. That back over here, I can go grab the URL. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want the URL for my pet detail, and I'm going to automatically pass in the primary key by just simply saying pet PK. And this will now give me back that URL. So let me go ahead and hit save here. And now let's go back to our root page. And there we have it. So now you're going to notice that we've got Sammy, Roscoe, and Artichoke. You're going to notice that all of my links are set up. So when I click on one of them, right up top here, you can see, whoops, let's go back to my browser. There we go. Sorry about that. All right, so let's back this up. So what I did is I went back to my browser. I went to the root of my app. There's now my list. And now I can hit any one of these. So let's say, for example, Roscoe. And what you're going to notice is that it's going to set me up with that URL. And there is my description right there. And that is the first bit of power that we're going to have from the view system that we have inside of Django. That's pretty cool. That's pretty slick. And if we stopped there, things would actually be already pretty amazing, because I was able to do that with a little bit of HTML, and again, with less than a dozen lines of code. That'd be hard to do with really any other framework. Django gives that to me. It's pretty slick. Okay. By the way, this is live, so feel free to say hi, ask questions, all that good stuff. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to turn my attention to the adopter. Now, the adopter, or what I want to focus in on for the adopter, is I want to focus in on the ability for somebody to register as an adopter. Now, from a web dev standpoint, what this is going to be is this is going to be a create call. So I want somebody to be able to create a brand new object. And, oh, that's fantastic. That's great to hear. Thank you. So I want to be able to create a brand new object. And if we think about everything that needs to happen for creating an object in web dev, there's a lot to it. It seems simple, but there's actually a lot of complexity, especially if we're going to do this securely, especially if we're going to do this right. So that normally, the normal flow is going to be something like this. That on the get side, we're going to display the form. And then on the post side, what we need to do first, actually I should back this up really, is, hey, thanks for the raid, Loop. So for all of you who are just tuning in, well, thank you. For all of you who are just tuning in, what we're doing here is we're working a little bit through a Django app. So, hey there. Thanks for the raid. Okay, so we're working our way through a Django app, and what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how to do a create. So on a normal create, here's the way that the flow is going to work. So the first thing that will happen is the user is going to issue a get command. So they're going to go to whatever the URL is. That's going to be done with a get. So we're going to display the form. Now the user is going to fill out the form, and then when they get to the bottom, they're going to, of course, hit submit. Now, when they hit submit, that's now going to post the data back to the server. That's how the data is going to get up. And it's usually that get and post that's going to be used to indicate where the user is on this workflow. So once we're in post, we now know that they're sending us data. Now, when they send us data, there's actually a lot that we need to do with it. The first thing that we need to do is take a look at whether or not we have a Csrf attack. Now, if you're not familiar with Csrf, Csrf stands for something, 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 something. And the actual description of it is this, is we could have our form faked by an attacker. And if they're faking our form, they could be doing a lot of bad things. They could be bypassing some level of validation. They could be denial of service. They could be trying to get information from a different user. Like, there's a lot of bad things that could be happening here. And as it turns out, protecting from Csrf is tricky. Like, there's a lot that actually goes into it. Well, fortunately, Django will actually take care of this for us pretty easily, which is nice. But the fact of the matter is that still needs to be checked. So that's a call out. We need to validate the form. We need to convert the form data into an object. And then last but not least is we need to then save that object and then also perform a redirect back to wherever it is that we want to take the user to. So there's a lot that goes into it. But a lot of this is actually really boilerplate code. Csrf is boilerplate. Validating a form is boilerplate. Converting the form data into an object is boilerplate. Saving the object, as long as we're just saving the object as a whole, boilerplate. And then performing the redirect, as long as we know where to go, again, boilerplate. So let's not write a whole bunch of code over and over and over and over again just to do this. Let's not do that, shall we? Let's instead take advantage of Django. So let's set up our adopter registration. Now I'm going to do this in 2 steps here. I'm going to take advantage of this little thing known as a as a model form. So what is a model form? Well, a model form is a perfect form. It is the model of what a form should be. It's probably way too early for dad jokes. Okay, so let's put that aside. What's a model form? A model form is a form that's based off of a model. So in our case, if we if we take a look back out at our models pie here, we've got a list of models. Okay. So if I say model form, what I'm actually going to do is create a form that's based off of this model. Or if we put this another way, what we're actually going to wind up doing here is we're really going to wind up creating what's sometimes known as a view model. If you've never heard of Mvvm, Mvvm stands for Model, View, View Model. So our model is what's going to wind up inside the database. Our view is what we're going to display out to the user. A view model is designed to be a little bit of a go-between between those two. Because what it is that I want to display out to my user is not always what's in the model itself. And our adopter is a perfect example of this. The way that our adopter is built, let me pull out the important line here. In our adopter, what I want you to notice is this user property. And this user property is bound to a user, is bound to a username and a password. So in theory, I could create a form that displays all the fields by default. And so one of those fields would be user. And so if I did that, what Django would do for me automatically is it would show the person that was looking at that form a drop-down list of user accounts from which they could choose to bind up their adopter to. That's probably not a good idea. So fortunately, I can go ahead and hide that. And this is exactly what this form is going to allow me to do, is it's going to allow me to create this view model where I can say, hey, these are the only properties that I want you to display. And I can even actually get fancier here. And we're not going to dig into this, but I just want to highlight this fact, is if I wanted to like add new properties or change the way that they behave or anything like that, I can do that here, which is really nice. So I'm going to say class meta, which is how I need to indicate this. I'm going to say model equals models dot, in my case, adopter. And then I'm going to say fields equals, and these are the only fields that are now going to display. So we're going to have our first name, we're going to have our last name, and we're going to have our background. So I'm very specifically not going to list out our user. So now this is all that's going to display out. And again, I could get fancier here. And I'm actually going to do a couple of things to this in a few minutes. But for right now, I'm going to leave it like that. So now let's set up our create view. So just like baked in, we have a list view and a detail view. You're also going to notice that we're going to have a create view. And what our create view is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to, well, create an item. So what this is going to want to know is, first of all, what form class, or in other words, what view model, if you will, are we going to be using? And I'm going to use adopter form. It's going to want to know where the template is. And so I'm going to say adopter create. There we go. And then it's going to want to know where to send the user to on success. And I'm going to hard code this to be /. If you wanted it to automatically go to details, it could do that for you as well. If you wanted to write in a little bit of extra code on where to send it when it's done, you could absolutely do that. So you do have complete control here. There's a lot of really neat things that this view can do for you. And if you head back out to YouTube, I just want to call this out partly as a shameless plug, but also partly because if you're interested more in how to like fully configure views and everything else, I did spend quite a bit of time on this on Tuesday. The video's not uploaded yet, but it will be up on our Reactor channel on YouTube. So definitely do go check that out. Okay, so there is all of the code that I'm going to need. This will now handle everything else for me. All that I need to do is set up my HTML template. So let's go ahead and create a folder. This is going to be called adopter. I'm going to need an HTML file, create.html. There we go. And let's paste in the initial block of HTML. There we go. Thank you, Megan. Perfect. All right. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just display out my form. Now, out of the box, the way that Django forms are going to work is they're going to require that I use a form tag. It's going to require that I call out the Csrf token. So remember again, Csrf, it's going to prevent somebody from faking my form. So I need to put that in there. I need to display my form, and then I need to add in a submit button. So my form, pretty straightforward. My submit button, pretty straightforward. The Csrf token, again, that's going to prevent somebody from faking my form. And then this is going to display out the form itself. So right now, it's actually still looking pretty good. I mean, it's much easier than having to manually punch out everything that's involved in creating an HTML form. That if you're anything like me, and I know I am, you probably find that one of the most tedious things in the world is having to create HTML forms. It's just a pain, having to make sure you've got all the names and IDs and everything else correct and adding in all the appropriate code for valid. I've got better things to do with my time. Yeah, it's a pain. And so honestly, if we stopped here and we said, hey, this is all the HTML that I need, it will automatically generate a form, even this right here would still be amazing. But fortunately, we are going to notice we're going to get even better things available to us here in just a minute. Let me, though, real quick here. Okay, add in a real quick H2. All right. Now I do need to add this in as a route. So we'll say path, and let's say adopter create views, adopter create view as view, and then name equals adopter create. Okay. So just registering that route, so that way it will it'll be available. Okay. Now that I've got all of that saved, let's come over here to my browser window, and let's go ahead and say adopter and create. Boom. So there is my form. Now, let's talk about the good stuff. The good part is there was very little that I had to do to make this happen. That it was a collective like 7 lines of code and like 4 lines in my HTML file. So I didn't have to do a whole lot of work to get there. But of course, the problem is the fact that it's not the prettiest of forms. Fortunately, again, if somebody else has run into a problem, chances are they've gone ahead and built a package, a framework, a library that we could take advantage of. And this is where Crispy Forms comes into play. That what Crispy Forms is all about is helping make it easier to display out forms. And this was a big part of what I talked about back on Tuesday. But what I really want to highlight here is the fact that it will give us the ability to automatically emit the appropriate HTML for Bootstrap. And it will also give us a lot of great tools that we can use for manipulating the form as it's going to be sent out. So for example, one thing that we highlighted back over here on our HTML is the fact that we had to add in a submit button. Well, let's think about this for a second. If I'm creating a form that's going to allow the user to send data, chances are, you know what I'm going to need? I'm going to need a submit button. So why do I have to put that in every single time? And so fortunately, I'm not going to have to. Or same thing with that Csrf token. That Csrf token is required. It's a security thing. That'd be very easy to forget, right? Well, fortunately, Crispy Forms will take care of that for me. And that form tag as well, Crispy Forms will take care of that. Now, I've actually already installed Crispy Forms. So you can go check the docs on how to do the install. I've already got it installed. So I'm going to update this to now go grab the Crispy Form tags. And then now all of this is going to go away. And it's going to be replaced with Crispy Form. That's it. And so now, if I save this and I go back to my browser, now when I do my refresh, what you're going to notice is that my display is much better. And if I actually poked into the HTML, what you would notice is the fact that it's got all the appropriate attributes for Bootstrap 4 for a form. Now it's still missing the submit button that I'm going to have to add in, and I'm going to show off how to do that right now. By the way, as far as Visual Studio 2019, wrong department. Okay. Now, I mentioned about our form here. I don't know why you're giving me that error message. I'll fix that later. Okay. Property. Yeah, isn't this amazing? Django does so many things with so few lines of code. I love it. Now, I am going to say real quick here that at the same time, while Django does do an awful lot for me, you are going to discover that it does require that you sort of do things the Django way. And so there's a little bit of a trade-off here. If you take a look at some other presentations that I've done in the past where I've talked about like Flask, which I also love. Flask and Django are basically like opposite ends of the extreme. That Flask does basically nothing out of the box except being a web framework. Like it basically, it's a web server. It's got a built-in templating engine. It's got built-in routing and everything else, but it basically stops there and then requires you to bring everything else that you need to the party, which again, if I want complete control, or if maybe what I'm looking to do is build a web app where I'm going to be using a lot of services, maybe like an ML model that I've built or something like that, Flask is a great choice for that. But if I'm looking for something that's going to give me a lot of great capabilities for manipulating and working with a database, Django is going to be the way to go. But again, Django is going to say, hey, in order for me to do our work, I need you to do things a particular way. So as long as you're willing to sort of work with Django, Django can do quite a bit for you. Yeah, so it is a little bit of a trade-off, but even still, like once you sort of get used to working in Django, you're just gonna fall in love with it. I'm a huge fan of this framework. Okay. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. This is meant to get something not as style needed done and completed so you can focus on tasks. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Csrf brings up a great point here about that it gives you the ability to focus in on how you want things to look without having to worry about the back end. That the tagline that Django uses is it's the web framework for perfectionists with a deadline. So it takes care of a lot of that nitty-gritty stuff that we don't necessarily want to worry about and frees you up to focus in on how you want the display to look. So it's really nice in that regard. Okay, from Crispy Forms, helper, import form helper, and from Crispy Forms layout, import submit. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm now grabbing two little helper items from Crispy Forms because what I want to do is I want to add in that submit button automatically. I don't always want to have to code that in. And so the way that I can do this is by using, first of all, this form helper. And what this form helper will do is it will give me the ability to really just completely lay out how it is that I want the form to look. So if you go take a look at the Crispy Forms docs, you're going to see that there's a lot of power in here that if you want to set specific HTML properties like autocomplete or setting the CSS class, or in my case, if you want to go in and add in new items, you can do all of that programmatically. And that way your HTML can literally just be Crispy Form and that's it. So you can focus then on just, hey, this is what I want to display out and be able to do that very quickly. Okay, helper, layout. So my layout is going to be all the forms that are going to be on the field. I'm going to just add on a submit button here. Register as an adopter, and then return helper. So what this property is going to do for me is this is going to set up crispy forms. That's what this is doing right here. So what's the change? What's the display update going to wind up being? Well, now if I take a look at my create here, that little register as an adopter, that is now there because I added that in programmatically into that helper. So that's the difference that that's going to be making there. And again, now this little create HTML, that's all the code that I need. Pretty slick. You don't have to code out manually forms anymore. Let somebody else do that for you. You've got better things to do. Okay. Now, I'm going to pause there on the registration of the adopter. And the reason that I'm going to pause there is because our adopter needs one very important thing. It needs a user. So we're going to need the ability for somebody to set up a username and a password. We're going to need the ability for somebody to log in and log out. And we're going to need the ability to do a little bit of security checks. So make sure that somebody's logged in, all that good stuff. So we're going to need all of that. And again, let's talk about this for a second. Think about the web apps you're going to be building. This is a very common thing that we're going to need. And so fortunately, Django is going to have a lot of built-in capabilities to help us do this with very little code. The question is self in Python similar to this in other languages? And the answer to that is yes. The one really interesting thing about Python is when you set up a function, you do have to indicate that self is going to be handed in as a parameter there. But otherwise, yeah, it's basically the same. Okay. So let's take a look at how we're going to start to allow somebody to log in, log out, create an account, all of that good stuff. Now, if we, again, think about web dev, this is something that's going to be pretty common. And if we think about handling usernames and passwords, this is something that so many developers get wrong. When you're working with passwords in particular, the best practice, the way to handle this, is to do what's known as a salt and a hash. Now, salt is going to be some little bit of random string, and hash is going to be a one-way operation for taking some bit of string and converting it into something else. And so what you'll actually wind up doing is taking the user's password, appending on the bit of random salt that you've generated for that specific user, and then hashing that value. And the end result is going to wind up being that my password is going to be much more secure, that even if somebody does gain the hashed value, they're not going to be able to convert that back. And there's a whole bunch of documents that are out on the internet that will explain how salting and hashing of passwords work and so forth. But the long and short of it is that's the way that I should be handling this. Now, it does take normally a bit of code to make all of that happen. Fortunately, Django will do all of that for me. So instead of me reinventing the wheel, instead of, more importantly, me making a mistake that's going to potentially add in a security risk, I'm instead going to let somebody else who's smarter than me have built it for me, and I'm going to take advantage of their tools. And Django will automatically manage salting and hashing of passwords for you. By the way, hash is one of my favorite things to do with leftovers. Just add in a potato, take whatever else it is that you've got, chop it all up, throw it in a pan, add some eggs on, away you go. Okay. Dad jokes. Nothing but dad jokes. All right, let's take a look at creating a login page. Now, just like before, where we have our create view and we've got our model form here, what we're going to notice is that built into Django off of contrib.auth is that we're going to have a set of forms available to us. And if I go into from Django contrib auth import views as auth views, we're going to notice that we've got a bunch of built-in views as well that we're going to be able to use. So I could actually use the ones that are available to me right out of the box. I could absolutely do that. I do not have to do what I'm doing right now. The reason that I'm going to do what I'm going to do right now is because of the fact that I want to be able to make sure that my form is going to display properly inside Crispy Forms. So I'm going to do this manually, or I'm going to do this with a little bit of code, even though in theory I really don't have to. By the way, to answer the question, this is the keyboard that I use. It's okay. I honestly find that the key reaction is not quite what it is that I'm looking for. So I don't have an answer, a good recommendation for you. But maybe somebody else in the chat does, as far as the keyboard. So the question was if I use an unconventional keyboard or anything like that. So there you have it. Okay. In any event, custom login form, and I'm going to say auth forms, and then let's, what am I looking for? What am I looking for? I want... authentication form. There we go. Sorry about that. You know, the thing is that it's called a login view, and so my brain was just looking for login form, and yeah, it threw me for a loop there. Okay, authentication form. Now, all I'm going to do with that is I'm just going to add in that crispy form property. I want to mention here that I could go ahead and like set this up as like a base class or something like that. But I'm trying to keep things relatively straightforward for demo purposes. So I'm going to be okay with the little bit of copying and pasting that I'm doing here. But if you're thinking, hey, wait a minute, Christopher, you've just copied and pasted that property again here, and you're going to do it again a little bit later, like, shouldn't you just go ahead and make that into a base class? And you're absolutely right. I could do that, but I'm just trying to keep everything sort of out in the open for demo purposes. So just to highlight that. Okay. Okay. what I've done is I've gone ahead and updated their built-in authentication form to use the appropriate Crispy Forms code. I've also gone ahead and grabbed their built-in login form, or login view rather, and said, hey, go use that form. That's all that I did. And so now I'm going to add in the HTML here. There we go. So this is now going to be the HTML that'll be displayed. I'm really just taking advantage of Crispy Forms again. Let's make sure that it's going to use that. Template name equals registration login.html. By the way, are you login or log off, or sorry, login, log out, or log on, log off people? Django is login, log out. Let me go ahead and register my URL here. Path, accounts, login, views, and then my login view, as view, and then name equals account, login. Login, log out, okay. You know, what's funny is I find myself honestly saying log in and then log off. So I do this weird like combination thing. I don't know why I do that. Okay. Now, I want to highlight when I'm creating my login path that I'm very specifically calling this accounts whack login. Need to make sure I put a / at the end here. And the reason that I'm doing it that way is because out of the box, that's what Django's going to be looking for when it looks to automatically redirect me to the login page. And so now I've got a login page. That was all the code that I needed. So if I sneak back over to my browser window and I now say login, and I hit enter, it's now going to be prompting me for my username and my password. Pretty slick. Now I realize I've sort of gone out of order on my run of show here. Let me just do this. There we go. We'll just update that. There we go. Cool. There we go. All right. So there's our login. And that was all the code that I needed to write for that. As far as the logout goes, what we're going to notice is that there's also a logout view that I can go ahead and use. And I want, whoops. Okay. And all I'm going to do is just simply set where it is that I want them to go when they log out. And then over here on my URLs, I'm going to add that in. Thank you. There we go, like that. Yeah, thank you for calling out the wrong monitor there. I apologize. I'll go back and do that. So there's my URLs. If I go back to my view, that was all that I added into the view there. So custom logout view, and I did this just to update the next page. So now I've got my login and logout capabilities. Of course, the question becomes, how can we see that in action there? Well, let's do this. Let's go to the base HTML. And let's sneak right down here. And let's add in sort of the stock standard of check to see whether or not the user is logged in. If they are, welcome them, give them the ability to log out. And if they're not, go ahead and give them the ability to log in. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, a little bit of code, if request.user is authenticated. So as you might suspect, that's going to tell me whether or not the user is authenticated. If they are, then I could go ahead and say div welcome user.username, and then maybe div anchor href equals URL. And I want account. Did I call it account or accounts? I have a great memory. It's just really short. Account. Okay. Account logout. There we go. Logout. Else. And then div anchor href equals boom boom URL account login boom boom boom. There we go. Okay. All right. So what I've got is, let's check to see whether or not the user is authenticated. If they are, display the username, give them a logout option. If they're not, then we'll go ahead and give them the opportunity to log in. So if I go back now to my browser, let's just go to the root page here. What we're going to notice is it's going to tell me that I'm logged in. And the reason that it's telling me that I'm logged in is because I logged in onto the admin page. And so as a result, that counts here. I can log out by hitting log out. And when I do that, now you're going to notice that my page is updated, gives me the opportunity to log in. When I hit log in, it will then prompt me for my username and my password. I click log in, and then sure enough, I'm now logged in, and we can see that updated. And I was able to do all of that with minimal code here. That if I go back over here to my views, I've got my custom login form with this little bit right here, which honestly is not required. It's only needed because I'm using Crispy Forms. Same thing here, only required because I'm using Crispy Forms. And then down below here on my logout, that was all that I needed. So really minimal code, and now I've already got the login and log off capabilities. Now I do need the ability to create a user, so let's view that. After, of course, a sip of technology, or a sip of technology, of cold brew. The question about the Google's new speech to text for the closed captioning, honestly, I don't know what it is that it's using. It was a plugin for OBS that I went ahead and added in. So I'm not exactly sure what it is that it's using. If it's keeping up with any accuracy level, I'd be impressed because I know that I've got a little bit of a funny speech pattern, I guess would be the way that I would put it. So if it's actually keeping up with me with pretty decent accuracy, then I'd say, hey, that's actually pretty good. Okay. Hello, Nar. All right. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the user creation here. So with login and logout, this is going to be pretty stock standard. That on login, we're going to ask you for a username and password. For logout, we're just simply going to get rid of your credentials. So that's pretty stock standard. But for doing an account creation, that's not necessarily stock standard, or at least the way that Django has set things up, it's not stock standard. If you wanted to say, hey, it is, and really plant a flag in the ground there, I'm not going to disagree with you. And in fact, I probably am going to agree with you on that. But the fact of the matter is that unfortunately, Django is not going to give us the built-in mechanism on the view side for creating an account. They are going to give us a nice little form that we'll be able to use, but it is going to be up to us to create the view from scratch. Fortunately, it's only going to be a handful of lines of code, but it is going to be up to us. So let's do it. Okay, so they do give us a user creation form. And what the user creation form will contain out of the box is it will contain a spot for a username and then 2 additional fields, password 1 and password 2, where it's going to automatically do the confirmation to make sure that both of those fields match. So it will have all of that built right in to that form. So that part is a good thing. I am going to want to, just as before, add in my little helper right here for crispy forms. And I could, if I wanted to, add in any additional custom information that that I might want. So I can do that here. In my case, I'm going to leave it with the default, and instead I'm going to turn my attention to a custom user creation view. And in this case, I'm going to use the form view. Now, previously, I used something like create view, or I used something like detail view, and I used something like list view. And in all of those cases, what would happen is I would bind this up to a specific model, and then it would be able to do some magic for me. The main difference that I'm going to have here is that, unfortunately, it's not going to be able to do that magic for me. That I'm not going to be able to just simply say, hey, here's my model, because I don't have a model. So I'll have to go in and write the code on my own. Not going to be a lot of code, but I am going to have to do this on my own. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to set the success URL here to be, you know what, let me do this the right way, from Django URLs import reverse lazy. What reverse lazy is going to do is this is going to do a URL lookup for me. So I'm going to say adopter create. I think that was what I called it. Again, great memory, just really short. Yeah, adapter create. So this is automatically going to pull out that URL for me. After you create your username and password, that's where I want to send you to. So basically, I'm setting this up as a wizard. And then down below is going to be the code to save the user, which I'm going to do in just a second here. I do want to back this up real quick because there was a couple of questions that came in. Number one is, am I planning on deploying Django to Azure App Services, having no luck? I'm sorry that you're having no luck there. I'm not going to be doing that today. I don't have the time. But if you hit me up on Twitter, if you've got a specific error message, I might be able, no guarantees, might be able to help point you in the right direction. It is a future video that I do want to build, is deploying out Python web apps into app services. So it is something that I want to do in the future. So yeah, and thank you both Nar and Roku Man for the kind words. I appreciate that. Okay, so let's come back over here to our custom user creation view. Now, just making sure that I've got my names correct before I do it. Nope, I'm glad I double checked. Okay, registration, there we go. Okay, so on every single view for modifying data, so this would include my delete view, my update view, and my create view. On each one of those, they will always have a form valid. And what form valid is going to do for you is this is going to be run just before the page finishes and we save data and route the user to the next page. So this is sort of a last call, if you will. That if there was anything that I needed to do to the data, I can do this inside of form valid. And this is actually going to become very helpful when we come back over here to allow the adopter to actually register. Because what I'll be able to do inside of form valid is I'll be able to grab the current user and assign them to the object that we're about to create. Now in my case, I'm going to use form valid to actually save the user account that was just created. So again, what we're doing here, I'm going to have a form. I'm going to ask the user, give me a new username, give me a password, confirm that password, hit submit. That's what they're going to do. So what I need to do first step is I need to actually save the user to the database. Now the one really nice thing is that the user creation form will have a built-in mechanism to do that for me. So by my calling form.save, that will automatically do that. Now, after we save the user, so now they're registered, the next thing that we need to do is to log the user in. Now, it does not do this by default. And the reason for that is because it really is sort of up to you as to whether or not you would decide to do that. That there are some people who say, well, just because you've created an account doesn't necessarily mean that you want to log in. If you ask me, if I'm creating an account, I would expect that to automatically log me in. I don't know. That's That's the behavior that I expect as a user. Maybe not everybody expects that, but I do. So I always like to build it that way. So the way that you do this, and this does get a little bit tricky because the two helper functions that we're going to use here are going to be Authenticate and Login. So what Authenticate is going to do is it's going to confirm that we've got a good username and a good password. Now, we already know that we do because we just created the user. But we still have to go through this step because what this is going to do is it's then going to go into the user database and go get me the user. And I'll then be able to hand this user over to Login, which will then set the appropriate cookie. So I'm going to say Authenticate. This is going to look for a username. And so my username is going to be form cleaned data get the username. And then the password is going to be form cleaned data get, and then we'll say password 1. Okay. So I'm just going to get rid of the extra spaces there. Okay. So this is now going to load the user. This is now going to set the credential cookie. So we'll say login and then self request and then the user that we just loaded. And then last but not least, is effectively called next, if you will, if you're an Express person. But basically, this is saying, all right, we're done here. Now, Django, you can do whatever it is that you would do next, which in my case is going to be to route the user to adopt or create. Okay. Now, this is probably the most bit of code that I've had to write yet to make something happen. But even still, especially when you compare this to other systems, it's a relatively small amount of code. Like when you really think about everything that that's going to be doing for me, and when you really think about everything that it's going to be doing for me and everything else, like proportionally, it's actually not a lot of code. I mean, it's the most that I've had to write. It's, doing a real quick bit of math there, about 12 lines of code, not counting comments. But again, all things considered, it's pretty crazy. The amount of work that little bit of code is going to do for me. Okay, so now let's go ahead and save that. And I'm going to go to my login page here. And I'm going to add in an anchor, href equals, and let's say URL account create. And let's go ahead and say don't have an account. Create one. There we go. And let's make sure that I get it registered. Okay, cool. So now let's go ahead and come back over here to my browser window, and let's see this little bit of code in action. So I'm going to say log out. I'm going to say log in. It's then going to say, hey, you don't have an account. Do you want to go ahead and create one? And then now it will prompt me for a new username, for a password, and then my create user down below. So all of that is right there. Now, I'm not going to use this form quite yet. That there's one more thing that I want to do to tie all of this up, and that's going to be to actually bind this to the user account, or to the adopter account rather, which is really sort of where we all started. That if you remember all the way back to about an hour and a half ago, that I was setting the scene, and what I really want to do is I want to make sure that an adopter can register and they can tie this to a user account. That's now where we're going to finish out. So we're now going to tie this all together, bring it all together, and allow an adopter to properly register. So there's going to be a last little bit of code that I'm going to have to set up here. Okay. So there was a question about using class-based versus function-based inside of Django. So one thing to note about Django is that there's quite a bit that you can do by using functions, sort of similar to how you might do this in Flask. And so the question then becomes, well, which should you use? For me personally, I like the class-based. And I'm going to say this partly for two reasons. Part of it is I'm certain because of the fact that I really came up, if you will. I grew up with Csrf. Well, technically long before that, I was doing BASIC and VBScript and things like that. But where I really came into modern development, for want of a better word, I came up on Csrf. I grew up on Csrf. That was where I cut my teeth. And so as a result, like thinking in classes and all of that good stuff, that is like ingrained into my brain. And so as a result, using the class-based views that are available and just setting a few properties, to me, is a relatively intuitive mechanism. So I personally prefer the classes, so that's how I go ahead and do this. The question is this Fluent UI? It's not. The question is, am I going to create an OAuth login? And the answer to that is no. But what I do want to highlight here is there are some great packages for Django that probably one of my favorite things about Django. I have a lot of favorite things about Django. But certainly towards the top of the list is the community around Django and all of the cool packages and libraries that are available. And there's some great OAuth packages that are there, which will give you the ability to do like Twitter and Facebook and all of that good stuff with really just a handful of lines of code, just like a little bit of configuration, and you're done. So I really dig that, and all of that is available. So yeah. Welcome to all my raters from Visual Studio. I'm actually just wrapping up here. Just taking a look at authentication and user creation and all of that inside of Django. So hi to everybody that's there. I don't know if John Galloway sent you over here. Hopefully he did, if only because I want to be able to say hi to John. I haven't seen him in way too long. I love John to death. He's one of the best human beings you will ever meet. Okay. In any event, let me finish all of this out. Form valid, self form. So if you remember from before, form valid is the last thing that's going to execute before we finish out. The big thing that this is going to give me the ability to do on a model-based view is it'll give me the ability to modify the object before it's going to be saved back. So just like before, I'll be able to grab the form, but because of the fact that this is tied to an object, I'm going to be able to say form.instance. And so now I can say self request user, and then I can say return super form valid, and then the form. So what this is going to do is it's going to grab the current user and bind it to the object, which is spelled like that. Now I do need to make sure that the user is logged in. And so what we're going to notice from Django contrib auth import mixins. There we go. There's a fantastic little mixin. Let me make sure I put it into the right place here. Boom. There's a fantastic little mixin called login required, which I still need to put into the right place. There we go. All right, sorry about that. There we go. And so what login required will do, sort of as the name implies, is it will make sure that the user has logged in. So what you're going to notice here, form valid. On form valid, I'm going to grab the current user, bind it up. And then what you're also going to notice here is the fact that on my, my view, I've now added in that login required mixin. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring this all together, shall we? So I'm going to go back to the adopter create page. This is where we started. Now, I want to highlight something here. Let me go back into my browser here because it happened really fast. So if you're going to notice in the title bar here, in the title bar, I've now typed in adopter whack create. When I hit enter, it automatically does a reroute to login for me. It says, hey, wait a minute. You need to log in first. So it's automatically confirming that. I'm going to go ahead and click on don't have an account, create one. It's then going to ask me for a username. So I'm going to go ahead and say Megan. I'm going to just use LastPass here to have it generate a password. And then I'm going to click create user. It's now going to route me over here. You're going to notice that it's logged me in. It's now going to ask me, hey, register as an adopter. And then I'm going to click register. And voila, it now tells me that I'm registered. Now I could go ahead and at this point create a view in which we could see the adopter, but we're just about out of time here. So I'm going to just take advantage of the admin page here. And voila. I'm going to take a look at the admin page here and just prove that it's been created. There is Megan right there. And when I click on Megan, you're going to notice there's all the properties and there is that bound user right there. And so over the course of the last hour 50 now, what I did with really about 100 lines of code, yeah, about 100 lines of code, I've gone ahead and set up a full auth system, an account creation system, and a couple of views that would allow me to see all of my data. So hopefully you've enjoyed all of this. Hopefully you've picked up a couple of cool things on Django. And with that, that's my time. Come find me on Twitter at GeekTrainer. There was one question about Flask or Django. You can hit me up on Twitter. Find me there. And I will see all of you again sometime in the future. Thanks again for tuning in. So long.